The diner on Maple Street had been open for 11 years, and in all that time, nobody had ever seen Eleanor Whitfield cry. She was the kind of woman regulars described as steady, the kind who remembered your order before you sat down, who never raised her voice, even when a customer did, who wore the same gray cardigan through 3 winters, because replacing it felt like an unnecessary expense. She was 52 years old, and she had been a waitress for 30 of those years, ever since her husband left and never came back, ever since she realized that raising a son alone meant showing up to work even on the days her body begged her to stay in bed. That morning, the diner was full. It was a Saturday, the kind of Saturday when families piled into booths and ordered too much food and let their children run wild between the tables. Eleanor moved through the chaos the way she always did, balancing plates on her forearm, refilling coffee before anyone had to ask. She had done this 10,000 times. She could do it in her sleep. But that morning, something in her hands betrayed her. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the letter from the collections agency still sitting unopened in her apron pocket. The one about her son Caleb's hospital bills. Maybe it was simply bad luck. Whatever it was, her fingers slipped on the edge of a tray, and in one long, terrible second, 6 plates of food crashed to the floor in front of the largest table in the restaurant. The sound was enormous. Ceramic shattering, syrup splattering across polished shoes, a child's orange juice soaking into someone's white sneakers. For a moment, the entire diner went silent, the way a room does right before it decides how to react. Then came the laughter. It started at the table where the food had fallen, a birthday party for a man named Gregory Anders, a real estate broker who had reserved the entire back section for his 40th birthday. Gregory laughed first, loud and humiliating, the kind of laugh that invites everyone else to join in. And they did. His friends chuckled. A teenager 2 booths over pulled out his phone, filming the mess. Filming Eleanor's face as she knelt to gather the broken plates with trembling hands. Someone muttered, "Should have hired someone competent," just loud enough for her to hear. A woman rolled her eyes and said she'd never come back to this dump. Eleanor didn't say anything. She had learned, over 3 decades of thankless work, that arguing with the bad moment only made it worse. So she knelt on the floor in her stained apron, sweeping shards of porcelain into a dustpan, while a birthday party full of grown adults laughed at her, like she was a punchline in someone else's celebration. It was in that moment, in the middle of the worst 30 seconds of Eleanor's week, that a small voice cut through the noise. "Why is everyone laughing? She's just trying to help." The voice belonged to a girl no older than 7, sitting at a booth near the window with her father. Her name was Ruby Callahan, and she had spent the last 20 minutes methodically stacking sugar packets into a small tower while her father, a quiet, tired-looking man named Walter Callahan, scrolled through emails on his phone, the way single fathers sometimes do when they're trying to hold together a business and a household with the same 2 hands. Ruby had seen the whole thing. She had watched Eleanor's tray tip. She had watched the plates fall. And she had watched, with the plain and unfiltered clarity that only children seem to possess, the exact moment kindness disappeared from a room full of adults who should have known better. She slid out of the booth before her father could stop her. "Ruby, honey, sit down," Walter said, reaching for her sleeve. But she was already walking small steps across the diner floor, weaving between chairs, until she reached the spot where Eleanor knelt among the broken plates. The laughter faltered, not because anyone felt ashamed, yet, but because a child moving through a room of adults has a strange, gravitational pull everyone watches, almost against their will. Ruby crouched down next to Eleanor, ignoring the syrup soaking into the knees of her leggings, and without a word, she began picking up the smaller pieces of broken plate and placing them gently into the dustpan. "You don't have to do that, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice cracking in a way it hadn't cracked in years. "You looked really sad," Ruby said simply. "I didn't want you to be sad by yourself." And that was it. That was the sentence that broke something loose in Eleanor's chest. Not the fall, not the laughter, not the video being taken of her worst moment. but the plain, unguarded compassion of a 7-year-old who saw an adult in pain and decided, without hesitation, to kneel down beside her. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for months, not just because of the plates, but because of the hospital bills, because of the quiet apartment she came home to every night, because of how long it had been since anyone had looked at her and seen a person instead of a service. She pressed her lips together, trying to hold herself together in front of a room full of strangers, but her hands were shaking, and Ruby noticed. "It's okay to cry," Ruby said, patting her arm the way children pat things they don't fully understand, but want to comfort anyway. "My mom used to say, crying means your heart is talking." The diner had gone almost completely quiet now. The teenager lowered his phone, suddenly uncomfortable with what he'd been filming. Gregory Anders, the birthday man, stopped mid-laugh, his face shifting into something closer to shame. Walter Callahan stood from the booth, torn between embarrassment and an overwhelming, aching pride in his daughter, and walked over to help. "I'm so sorry," Walter said to Eleanor, kneeling down to help gather the last of the broken ceramic. She just doesn't like seeing people hurt." "She's remarkable," Eleanor whispered, wiping her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint smear of syrup on her cheek. "You're raising her right." Walter's throat tightened. Raising Ruby alone since his wife passed 2 years earlier had felt, most days, like failing quietly in 100 small ways. Nobody noticed. Hearing it from a stranger, in the middle of a humiliating public moment, in front of a room that had just watched his daughter do something instinctively better than every adult in the building, it landed somewhere deep. The manager, heavy-set man named Douglas Grier, who had watched the whole scene from behind the counter, finally came around to help, but by then, the damage, and something greater than damage, had already been done. Gregory Anders, his birthday mood thoroughly deflated, walked over to Eleanor with his wallet already out. "I'm sorry," he said, and for once, he meant it. "That wasn't right, what we did. Please, let me cover the cost of the plates." And he hesitated, glancing at Ruby, who had gone back to helping stack the dustpan pieces. "Let me leave something for you. For the trouble." He pressed several folded bills into Eleanor's hand. More than enough to cover a broken tray of dishes. More than enough, in fact, to make a dent in the bill, sitting folded in her apron pocket. Other tables, watching the shift in the room, began quietly doing the same. A woman leaving an extra 20 by her check. A young couple insisting Eleanor keep the change from a 50. Small gestures rippling outward. From the moment, a child had chosen kindness over cruelty. Eleanor didn't say much. She couldn't. She simply nodded. Over and over, tears sliding freely now, no longer trying to stop them. When the mess was finally cleaned and the dishes replaced, Ruby returned to her booth, climbing back into the seat across from her father, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all, as though kneeling beside a stranger's pain was simply the most obvious thing in the world to do. Eleanor came by their table before her shift ended, carrying 2 slices of apple pie she hadn't been asked to bring. "On the house," she said, setting them down in front of Ruby and Walter. "For the kindest customer had in 30 years. Ruby beamed, entirely unaware of the weight of what she'd just done. Entirely unaware that she had, in less than 2 minutes, reminded an entire room of adults what basic human decency looked like. Walter looked up at Eleanor. "Thank you," he said. "And it wasn't about the pie." "No," Eleanor said, glancing at Ruby, who was already digging her fork into the pastry with the single-minded joy only children have for dessert. "Thank her." That night, after the diner closed and the last dish was dried, Eleanor sat alone in her small apartment with the collections letter finally open on the table in front of her, next to a stack of folded bills that would cover more than she'd expected. She thought about the video the teenager had almost posted, the one that would have shown only her humiliation, her worst 30 seconds, frozen forever on some stranger's phone. Instead, what people would remember, what she would remember, was a little girl who knelt down on a dirty diner floor because she didn't want anyone to be sad alone. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but 3 weeks later, Walter would return to the diner and quietly cover the remainder of Caleb's hospital bill after learning the truth from Douglas, insisting it was the least he could do, telling Eleanor that his daughter had taught him something that day too, that sometimes the smallest people carry the largest hearts, and it's the rest of us who have to catch up. But that morning, Eleanor didn't know any of what was coming. All she knew, as she finally turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, was that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she hadn't felt invisible. She had felt seen. And somewhere across town, a house with a nightlight shaped like a moon, Ruby Callahan slept soundly, having already forgotten the whole thing, because for her, it had never been a lesson. It had simply been the only right thing to do.